Hello and welcome to this whole talk here. It's about the experiential design and immersive architecture of Half-Life Alyx. My name is Kent Bai of the Voices of VR podcast, and I had an amazing time playing this game, Half-Life Alyx, and I found myself wanting to unpack it and talk about it with other people. And I wanted to talk about my spatial experience of this. And there's so many tools that are available made from Valve to be able to do things that we could never really do before and be able to unpack this experience. But I also last year went to a whole immersive architecture, like the future of the immersive architecture of the internet at the Architectural Association with Fredrik Hellberg and Laura Lesmes. And previously I had met Andreea Cojocaru, who's also an architect. So both Andreea and Fredrik are architects, they're in the VR space. And so I kind of selfishly wanted to see how the architects would talk about this experience, just to see how they use their language, the vocabulary, the tools to be able to unpack different aspects of experiential design. So this is a good opportunity for us to kind of geek out. We've been holding back speaking to each other about this. And so we're going to kind of present to each other and to everybody else, and then kind of invite a larger discussion between us, and then we're going to open it up for the folks that are here at the end. But first, I just wanted to allow both Fredrik and Andreea to introduce themselves. So Fredrik, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Kent, and thanks so much for setting this up. It's really exciting. So I'm Fredrik Hellberg. I lead a architectural practice called Space Popular together with Laura Lesmes. And together we also teach a master studio at the Architectural Association that Kent was just mentioning here in London. And we do actual buildings and interiors, but we also spend a lot of our time in doing exhibitions and speculative projects that are thinking about what the virtual how it might impact architecture and space in, let's say, the next 30 years or so.
Great. And Andreea?
Hi, everyone. I am Andreea Ion Cojocaru. I am the co-founder and CEO of NUMENA. We are a very experimental type of studio in Germany. And what makes us so special is that we are a group of architects who code. And because of that, we work on real building projects as well as virtual reality projects, not necessarily for the construction industry. We do VR for marketing, simulators, and all of that. And I'm very passionate about the philosophical aspects and theoretical aspects of VR and kind of where this could go.
Awesome. Yeah, I know we've had quite a good number of deep dives philosophically in a lot of the phenomenological aspects. So, okay, we're going to dive into the next section here, which is each of us are going to give like a visual presentation. And just a bit of context is that when I went to the Architectural Association, I just loved how the architects are able to do these spatial videos. If anybody's seen Hyper Reality by Keiichi Matsuda, he's trained as an architect. And so there's a certain ways that the architectural lens does a really interesting ways of talking about spatial design. So I'm super interested to see what Fredrik and Andreea have to say. But first I'm gonna set a little bit more of a broader context, not specifically about the architecture, but more about the experiential design of Half-Life Alyx. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and make sure if I can get just confirmation that you can see it.
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about the experiential design of Half-Life Alyx. And the two major questions that I'm going to be asking are, hold on, let me get this. Okay. Are, what makes Half-Life Alyx so compelling, first of all? But secondly, how do we talk about our spatial experiences? Okay, so there's a developer from Valve who talked to Road to VR on April 14th, and Robin Walker, and he said, when we build Half-Life, we just build it one piece at a time, conceptually one room at a time. And so when I started to think about my experience of Half-Life Alyx, I wanted to see like an architectural blueprint. I wanted to see like a top-down view of the different worlds that I was going through, just to be able to break down the essence of this experience, if it is breaking down room for room. So I kind of sketched out, the first level and started to draw it out, but I really wanted like an automated way to do it or just something better. So I turned to some of the tools within the V console, and there's these tools to be able to do to toggle the different floor plans, but that's still like difficult to get a clear floor plan. I tried to kind of zoom around with VR Fly enabled and to try to like look at this space, but again, that wasn't a great. What I find is that I just went back to this kind of simple, you're going from room to room and it's a linear experience. And from that, then I could essentially just start to show a list of the rooms and then start to talk about the different aspects of the experience. And I'll be sort of unpacking how I eventually got to this point step by step. So let's start by just walking through. So you start Half-Life Alyx, you see this amazing overview, you go into this room, you get a message from your dad, you can play with markers. And so then you go into this very small hallway, and then you go outside and you see this large scale strider that's walking around, and you're getting this big sense of this space. You go into this room, you're able to look around, you go into this hallway, you open up the elevator, you push a button, you come out, and you have this little moment of the narrative. And then you see the Combine soldiers outside, you walk through this small little hallway, you go outside, you have another little chat with this person who gives you a little bit more context as to what's happening. You're walking around, you see these Combine soldiers that are sort of activated as you're moving. You walk down the street, you see more action. You're trying to get a sense of, okay, there seems to be some sort of occupation. You walk into this room, and up these stairs, you see this woman walk by. Okay, she seems to be like hiding from something. You go outside again and you see these birds. You look up and you see this ship like fly over you. And then as you're walking, you see like this skyline of City 17, and first time getting to see that. Then you go back inside, you go down the elevator shaft, you open up the door, and all of a sudden the Combine soldiers are there. And they kind of take you in. So what I see is that there's, first of all, a dialectic between being inside and outside. So I'm just going to start there and kind of break down these different scenes, and you can kind of see this as a bit of a timeline as you go through, and you start out, you're outside, you see this big sense of the space, you go inside and you have a little bit of a story element, and you kind of figure out the markers, you play around, you go back into this small space, and then you go out again, and then you go back inside for a while, and you kind of go into the series of kind of dimly lit rooms. And then you come outside again and you're able to explore rounds. Again, you go inside and then outside and then inside again. So until you get to the end. So you kind of see this inside-outside dynamic as you're going back and forth. And you can kind of see this as a timeline, or you could go top down and kind of see that it's kind of like bouncing back and forth. Okay, so what I wanted to say about this is that all of these immersive experiences are going in between these different contrasts, whether the contrast is inside or outside, whether it's you're putting your energy outward or you're receiving energy. All of the modulation of human experience tends to be like this, these polar opposites of on one extreme to the next. Excuse me. And so part of what makes Half-Life Alyx so compelling is that it does a great job of modulating in between a lot of different flavors of presence. You're either solving puzzles, you're fighting, you're sort of exploring the world around you, or you're learning about the world through these different aspects of story. And so this dialectic between the constriction and the expansion, and I feel like that's sort of the heart at the root of all these immersive experiences is the contraction and the expansion. And Chinese philosophy, they have a way of talking about it in terms of the yang and the yin. The yang is, energy that's going outward, while the yin is more of the inward. The yang is sort of like the sun, and the inward yin is more of the moon. It's either you're giving energy outward or you're receiving energy. You're either interacting with something and exerting your will into the experience, or you're receiving and consuming something. So another way of kind of breaking that down is through these four flavors of presence, whether that's active presence, mental and social presence, which are the more yang outward expressions, and the more receptive yin are the embodied presence and the emotional presence. And you can kind of think of it as making choices and taking action of you engaging into the world, or you're somehow passively receiving what's happening around you through your sensory experience, or you're having your emotions modulated through this building and releasing of tension, this consonance and dissonance cycles, either through music or the story. Another way to think about it is through the lens of communication mediums. And so, the active presence, you have a lot of video games, the social mental presence, you have the internet, the World Wide Web, literature, any abstractions of language. And then the more receptive of film is a great way of modulating your emotions. and then a virtual and augmented reality are able to modulate our sensory experience for the first time and really give us this sense of being embedded into an environment. And I think that's a lot of what Half-Life Alyx is doing, is doing that sort of environmental aspect. So if we break it down into the different aspects, you have the combat and the interactions, the puzzles and the navigation, you're gathering resources and observing the environments, or there's either stories, cutscenes, radio dialogue with Russell, soundscapes, or lighting. So I started to kind of break down each of these different scenes and then see how it kind of broke down into, which things were being focused as I go from room to room. And so I broke down each of these rooms and then kind of qualitatively started to break down different aspects that were happening in each of those rooms. And if we just sort of walk through the thing there, we have the skyline, you have the flying ships to give you the sense of the story, you're interacting with objects, and then you go into the room, you interact with Eli, then you open the door, there's markers to play with, and then you are exploring the doll car way, that there's light switches you play with, you have your interaction with the first door, then you go back outside and you see the skyline in the sense of scale, you see the strider, you're able to explore this room, look around, you get more context about the world, play with the snark animal, there's a camera there, there's objects, you go outside, you kind of have to solve a puzzle to operate the elevator, you have a conversation with the woman, gives you more context as a story. There's a transitional liminal space, which is more about you just having this sense of embodied presence. You explore more outside, you have another chat, you see what's happening. There's navigation affordances where you can and cannot go. There's a woman in the stairs, and then you see the skyline, the ships flying by, and then you're captured by the Combine. So you can kind of see that there's a pretty good balance, even within the first world. They're really trying to just introduce you to each of these different dynamics, how to interact with things, how to navigate, the overall story, and then just giving you a sense of the affordances of VR. And so I had gone through a number of these different worlds and tried to really categorize, could you boil down each of these worlds down to a center of gravity of what that world is about? And it does seem like you can kind of do that. There is this, some worlds are more about fighting and combat, some worlds are more about, solving puzzles, some are more about just telling you the story, and others are more about you just being embedded in the world. You could see that, in this column, it's mostly about this environmental presence, which is kind of the architectural aspects and all of the different interactions. There's embodied interactions with the gameplay. And so, they're really leveraging this aspect of the feeling like you have a sense of embodied presence there. So just to quickly kind of go through 3 of the chapters, just to kind of summarize some trends. Once you get your gun and you go into the second chapter, 2.1, there's the quarantine entrance. Most of this is about you solving puzzles to get into the quarantine, but it's also about you establishing your relationship with Russell with these kind of small little blocks here. Russell's talking to you over the radio and he's just introducing you to the world. You get a lot of information about who he is and who you are and more of context. And there's only a few enemies in this world. And then you go to the next world, the HU pistol, which is the chapter 2.2, and there's a lot of enemies that you're battling. This is more about you learning how to fight, how to manage your resources, how to swap out your ammo. And there's some puzzles there in terms of how do you open the door, how do you navigate to the next place, but mostly it's about combat. And then after you do all that combat, then it goes and it's more about you receiving more context of the story, and you have an interaction with the Vortigaunt, and then it's also you just exploring the world and having this sense of embodied presence. So you can see that as I walk through these 3 levels, and then I go back to the summary of the entire game, you can kind of see how it kind of bounces back and forth between the combat and the puzzles, and then sometimes it'll just jump over and you'll be more about, receiving the world and exploring. Okay, so that's sort of a summary of how to talk about it spatially. I want to just dive into a couple more things here before I wrap up. This aspect of emotional immersion, I think, is really interesting. Some of the things that they're doing in Half-Life Alyx. So there's a way to go into a vConsole and type in some of these different commands. There's different client soundscapes, so 226 soundscapes all together. So for any given level, you can type in this command of soundscape print debug. It'll tell you all the different soundscapes. And it'll also give you the kind of the GPS coordinates as to where those begin. And so you can set the position to go there directly and kind of check out where that is. Or you can enable other ways to see these entity messages that are going back and forth to see where those are getting triggered. But for each of these soundscapes, they are aggregated of a number of different sounds, and those sounds really create a mood and a vibe. And whether that's you're about to fight enemies, but they do a lot of modulating your emotions by having these different soundscapes. And there's a lot of ways that you can actually kind of deconstruct and really analyze the individual sound samples, but also the pacing of how these soundscapes are paced out through the course of the world. And you know, if you look at it through the lens of the rooms, then you can start to pace out as well how they're using the music to really modulate your emotions. The other thing is that the lighting here is just absolutely amazing. It's some of the best lighting that I've seen in any of the experiences. The textures are amazing. And there's actually a way to bring up a developer menu to actually sort of disable the lighting. And so you can be in a room that looks like really has a specific mood, and then you can turn it off. And it can be like, oh, wow, this is what this room looks like without the lighting. This is what you see by default in most experiences. It's just, you know, not so compelling. But as soon as you turn the lighting on, then it just gives so much more powerful impact. A lot of volumetric lighting, a lot of fog that they use throughout Half-Life Alyx. Most of the Half-Life Alyx, vast majority is underground. And because of that, they're able to leverage this type of mood lighting. And one of the things they do a lot within Half-Life Alyx is from room to room, they'll shift kind of like the key color. It'll go from like orange to green, or you'll have kind of like the neon lights and sunlight. And so just from going from room to room, there's a contrast that's happening from the lighting. So just in conclusion, what makes Half-Life Alyx so compelling? Well, I think it's because they're able to build and release tension in so many different ways, whether it's you're going inside, outside, you're having you engaged actively with your mental and social presence or active presence, or you're receiving with the emotional and body presence. And then you're also from the lighting and the sound, they're just really, it feels like a really good balanced experience where you're able to do a lot of different interactions and feel like it's got a rich story that's compelling, it's interesting, you want to explore the world, it's interesting to look at. And they just did a great job of overall doing this kind of consonance and dissonance cycles. But, you know, the other thing is like, how do we talk about these spatialized experiences? And I think what I tried to show is that, you know, Half-Life Alyx is broken up into rooms that you can break up those rooms and really start to analyze each of those rooms, see what the quality of presence in each of those rooms, and see how over the course of a level it goes back and forth. But then you start to have like these center of gravities across all of the experiences to see how it goes. So that's all that I have, and I'm going to turn it over and stop screen sharing and let the other presenters dive in. So thank you. Oh, Andrea, did you want to go ahead and share your screen? Oh,
yes.
Okay, cool.
So, can you see it?
Yep, can see it.
Okay, so just before I dive into this, I have two arguments that I want to make. But before that, I want to say a few words about the types of arguments that I'm going to use. So what you're going to hear in the next 10 minutes is a very kind of old school classical approach to architectural theory. This is not architecture 101. This is what Ken would say a deep dive. It's like kind of advanced stuff. But I'm very interested in using this opportunity with all of you here to really test this interdisciplinary approach where we have a conversation between people that are more into programming and game design and people like myself that come from such a classical training into how you're supposed to read architecture and the possible meanings that architectural design could have. So I'd be very interested at the end of this to kind of see or get your feedback as to how you perceive of these ideas. The other point I want to make before I start is that I'm not going to talk about specific design details in Half-Life Alyx in these 2 points. The intention is more to do the theoretical heavy lifting right now and put on the table for all of you what the perspective is that I'm going to use for the rest of the discussion to bring my arguments forth. So the first point I want to make is about Jeff. I hated every single minute of this chapter I absolutely hate it every second. However, I think is the most important part of the whole game. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And my thesis as to why is this here. Some of you might recognize the images on the right. They are a part of Funny Games, Michael Haneke's horror flick from 1997. Some of you might be familiar with the American version from 2007 with Naomi Watts in it. What is mind-blowing about this horror game is that it shows absolutely no overt violence. Everything, it's implied, indirect, psychological violence. And I think the mechanisms behind what makes this movie so bloody efficient are exactly the mechanism behind the Jeff chapter. Of course, they're realized in using very different methods. And the methods behind Jeff are very spatial. But the framework, the basis is the same. So here is a quote from a Half-Life Alyx designer. He says about Jeff. So he says, the biggest takeaway from early experiments was the tension of being in a room and having to get close to this thing that people really didn't want to be close to. Not just it invading your personal space, but you having to enter its space to progress. So two things are going on here. First, the main mechanism that they're going after is the idea of anticipatory fear. And the second thing going on is that you are entering a game in this chapter with very different rules than what you had to deal with until here. So if before you kind of have, you saw enemies and there was like a shoot on sight strategy, here's very different. Here you have to go into almost like a psychological relationship to this creature that you just cannot kill, and you have to figure out how it ticks. And I have some very interesting side-by-side comparisons between strategies used in the Jeff chapter and strategies used in Funny Games. So the Half-Life designer says the initial versions were just a large empty box that Jeff would wander around in while you avoided him, but it was an immediate hit during a company-wide playtest. And this is Roger Ebert talking about Funny Games. You, the lab rat, are placed in a Skinner box and subjected to random negative stimuli. Haneke, whose background is in psychology, philosophy, and theater, assumes the role of empirical taskmaster. So basically, you are being put in a box, and a lot of very precise tests are being run on your reaction towards this thing. And things are being very meticulously designed to increase the psychological relationship you have with fear and with Jeff. One more comparison. The same designer says about Half-Life in this chapter. Well, now you can essentially leave your gun in its holster the whole time. Players previously had to juggle firefights alongside avoiding Jeff. These moments were meant to give him opportunities to demonstrate how powerful he is on something that wasn't you. But that combat was ultimately removed because it killed the otherwise scary tension for many people. This is Peter Bradshaw reviewing Funny Games for The Guardian. There are not even real plot developments to disperse or deflect the agony. How very feeble genre horror looks compared to this. So, in a funny way, the designers of the game and Haneke reach exactly the same conclusion, that any kind of distraction actually deflects the tension. This is the complete opposite from all the other chapters, where in order to make things scarier or more dangerous, you just add more enemies that keep coming at you and you keep shooting. So the change in psychological pace and strategy is absolutely monumental between chapter 7 and everything else. even the last sentence in Bradshaw's review of funny games is a perfect match. If you imagine playing something like Saints and Sinners and shooting zombies in front of you, how much less agonizing and scary and frightening is that compared to this apparently simplistic approach of dealing with this one stupid enemy stuck in this distillery. So it actually makes other games in the same genre really look feeble. So if you can't stop watching, which is the case with funny games, although you absolutely hate it, or you can't stop playing, although you absolutely hate it, which happened to most of us during this chapter, it is because you're in. You are caught inside this very complex psychological power game that completely lacked in any other chapter. And I hope we will go deeper into the spatial details of how exactly this is achieved in Half-Life. My second argument is completely different. I want to talk about corners. So corners has been one of the hottest topics in architecture, in both design and theory for the past 500 years. And the irony is not lost on me that we are here talking about the super advanced technology of virtual reality, and the architect comes and says, well, actually, we are still discussing in our field about how we turn corners, but that's completely true. And this is my thesis for this point. The idea is that these two images show an identical spatial strategy that is absolutely fundamental to spatial design. But before I explain that, I have to take a detour through architectural history. So this is where architecture one-on-one comes in. Before the Renaissance, we talk about the relationship between the person and architecture as being one that's transcendental. This is a very fancy word to mean that you are not able to use your senses or your comprehension faculties to completely understand what the message is that's being transmitted through you, either through a painting or a work of art of any kind, such as a church. So this idea doesn't just apply to art and architecture, it applies to the entire world. So before the Renaissance, the basic tenet was that God mediates the subject's relationship to the world. That there is something else, some magic, some godliness, something that we just have to get into a special, unconscious, almost trance to somehow access and see a glimpse of, if we're lucky, but that is something else is fundamentally beyond our senses and beyond our ability to understand. And of course, control of the production of images, and in that I also include architecture, that dealt with this problematic was the task of the church. And if you go into the Middle Ages and you actually look at some of the documents that where this was being discussed, this is not just a modern interpretation of what was going on. The key people in the church were very aware of these tenets. They're not just art history. During the Renaissance, something monumental happened, which is our relationship to buildings and to reality became immanent. Again, this is a fancy word for saying what you see is what you get. So man's perception of the physical world is now mediated by man's own perceptual mechanism and cognitive processes. There is no more special something in the world. And this is a very new, what we call subject to object relationship. You enter a building and you are not required to just somehow try to feel its essence. You can look at it and see it and understand the relationship between the different parts. You can use your mind process that, and that's it. It is designed and made for man. There's no other special sauce involved. And the way this was done during the Renaissance was through a return to classical values and the very interesting rules of classicism, so Greek and Roman classicism. However, as Tafuri notices, and Tafuri is one of architecture's greatest critics, humanism actually surreptitiously introduced novitas under the guise of recovering the antique. What he means by this is that the classical architecture was just a pretense to do something that was of utmost interest to the intellectuals of that time, which is to introduce through spatial design new systems of thought. And I'm going to show you how they did that in a second. And of course, who was very much against the idea of new systems of thought during that time? The church. So a lot of these architects whose building I'm going to show were not on good terms with parts of the church. There are, however, certain issues with making the physical reality and particular buildings immanent. So what you see is what you get, eliminating any kind of magic from them. And we're still struggling with some of these issues today. So to give you a very quick and probably confusing overview, because I don't have time to dive into this any deeper, but you have this very pivotal figure in architecture, Vitruvius, a Roman architect who 2000 years ago said architecture has three important tenets: their utility, firmness, and delight. Then something very strange happened when Alberti, another very important architect, said 1,500 years later, architecture should not only stand up, it should look like it's standing up. And this is exactly his phrasing. So it's a very peculiar thing to say, right? Like, why is it important not only for it to stand up, but to look like it's standing up? What in the world does that mean? Then things get even more confusing in the timeline of architectural history. Derrida, a philosopher, shows up in the 60s. For those of you not familiar with Derrida, he was the founder of deconstruction. So this is something that attacks structuralism and basically made the argument that there is no fixed meaning in the world. Everything is all about a matter of context and interpretation. So everything can actually be reinterpreted if you just change the perspective with which you're looking at that thing. And Derrida had just a massive influence in all fields, basically, of knowledge since the 60s. And he was really bothered by architecture. He had a very difficult relationship with architecture and made him say things like architecture is the locus of the metaphysics of presence. Again, these are just fancy words to say that because elements in architecture not only need to stand up, but also look like they're standing up. So a column doesn't just need to act like a column, it needs to also look like a column. And this relationship is so tight. No matter how badly he tried to apply his philosophy to the column, he couldn't decouple the way a column looks, so the sign of the column, from what a column is supposed to do, which is hold up the ceiling. So he saw architecture as this ultimate bastion in this world that now is post-structuralist, now is full of flexible meaning. So he said architecture is the fortress of metaphysics. And what I want to propose next is that there are actual ways to talk about architecture that imply a moving beyond the immanence, of moving beyond this annoyingly fixed nature of physical reality, this annoying physicality of bricks and stones. And we're back to this. The key person on the right is Bramante. This image is the corner of the cloisters of Santa Maria della Pace. And I would say this is one of the top 3 most famous corners in architectural history. It's of absolutely monumental significance because of this. If you look closely, you will see the most unusual detail in the Renaissance. It's as if the edges of two column capitals are intersecting, implying that the columns have been swallowed somehow inside this corner. So the reading of this is that there is a datum at this intersection, but somehow the lining of the arches left and right continue in some kind of imaginary space beyond that corner, and this little detail is a representation of that idea. If we look at the image from Half-Life Alyx, there's a similar thing that happens towards the end of the game. So I think architecturally, this is to me the most interesting part, hinting at where we could take our approach to architecture in virtual reality. So there is a datum that mirrors the space on the bottom. And of course, you can take this further and say, instead of one mirror plane, you could have 10 or 100 mirror planes. But there is an extra element that goes beyond the walls and the architectural elements in the wall. There is, again, this extra sauce, some magic that produces this mirroring of the space that is not included in the actual design. That's just something else, a different dimension that's implied in there. Quickly, these are some typical architectural diagrams that explain the kind of thing that happened with that Bramante corner. So in the diagram in the center, it shows the solution that many other architects have used for similar courtyards. So they have designed the corner exactly in this way, which allow them to show two halves of columns with capitals, complete halves. But if you do the mental exercise of continuing the line of arches up and intersecting them, you will see that they will intersect in a very ugly way. If you do this mental exercise with the solution Bramante did, which is the diagram on the right, you will see that the implication that these lines of arches just continue infinitely. So what happens when you're actually standing there, and I urge you all to go visit these cloisters next time you are in Italy. So you walk around and all of a sudden, let's say you are an architecture enthusiast, you just notice this little bulb, this little detail, and you're like, what the hell is that? Because an architect like Bramante and all the classicist architects during that time were so incredibly precise in their calculation and in detail that it's just rare that you'll see something so obvious, obviously wrong, right? Quote unquote wrong. So you pause and you look at it, and when you understand what that is, when it hits you, what the implication of that little detail is, you actually are standing all of a sudden in a very different courtyard. You're not just enclosed by four sides that are finite, that end of the corner. You realize that you're actually enclosed by four infinite walls that go into the space of imagination beyond that corner. So it's a very experiential kind of flip that happens in your mind. It changes the space you're in. 150 years later, more architects are doing strange things with the rigidity of the classical orders and classical architecture. So exactly what Tafuri has told us about. Borromini. So you have on the left Quattro Fontane and on the right Sapienza, two very important churches. And what the hell is going on here? I mean, they are kind of bastardizing these classical order like there's no end. If the Greek and Romans would have seen this, they would have just cursed us forever. So why are these so important, aside from the fact that they just kind of look amazing? These are some diagrams that are trying to understand the different perspective and vantage points that are implied in all these curvatures and all these moves that Borromini is doing. And if you compare this with the classical frontality of traditional Greek and Roman architecture, you will understand how much of a, oh my God, this approach to design is. So it's basically assuming that the viewer, so the subject of this architecture, doesn't just sit in one place and observe the building from one viewpoint. It assumes the subject is in multiple places in the same time. These are some more experiential diagrams of the same kind of spaces. This was a big exhibit at Harvard a few years ago that dealt with these issues. So if you want to see trippy architecture that's also incredibly intellectual and hides behind it all of architectural history, go to Rome and visit these 17th century churches. They will blow your mind away. You don't need to read anymore. So what does this mean for architecture? Well, that's not the relevant question for me. The most important thing that this line of architectural thinking implies is the fact that I'm not just one subject. Inside me, I am being put into different positions and different vantage points and different perspective. I am somehow being multiplied. And if we look at Borromini, there's a datum that implies that maybe there is anatomy that is the subject of another kind of architecture that is in some kind of like transcendental other kind of dimension that's nonetheless implied in the initial design. So this is the potential that is implied in these churches, and it's absolutely for me the potential implied in that image from Half-Life Alyx and in virtual reality. It's not about doing fancy designs for the sake of designs and for the sake of architecture. It's about using design to tap into hidden and amazing potentials that are inside ourselves. So I go to that courtyard in Rome every time I can, just because I want to experience that flip of the brain of being from one physical space into another, although the actual physical space hasn't even changed. So for me, that's the ultimate potential of spatial design. And I hope to see more virtual architecture explore it, because we can iterate much faster in the virtual space than we can with physical architecture. That was it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andreea. That was great. The deep dive, as you said, you delivered on that deep dive. Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on both of those things. I'm going to let Fredrik jump in here. And then I think what we're going to do is maybe very quickly share some of our thoughts between the three of us, and then very quickly open it up after that and invite people to jump in and to either share their thoughts, to share their questions, and to kind of open it up into a broader discussion. But yeah, I'm glad that you brought up both of those points. Yeah, with that, let's hand it over to Fredrik, and then let you present what you're going to present, and then we'll sort of unpack it a little bit and then open up to a broader discussion.
Thanks, Kent. Okay, so I should just begin by saying it took me 20 hours to complete Half-Life Alyx, and I was not quite ready for it to be a horror game, which it actually is. I don't really feel like that afterwards. And I played the original Half-Life in '98, but I haven't played any of the other ones. I have tried to catch up on the story. And again, I'm an architect, not a gamer, so excuse me if I don't get the terminology right. So I'm going to speak mainly about City 17, which is the site for this game. And I'm going to start by talking about the sense of place, or Genus loci, as architects often use this term. And the kind of four main points, of which the first one is the one that I think is maybe lacking a bit. That would be interesting to hear from the other guys what you think. But City 17's modern past, its rule under the Combine rule, which are these kind of alien forces that rule this place now, and the Sen wildlife. There's this kind of growth that has taken over this place. So this is just my, I've just taken the assets directly from the files and created little films in using twin motion to kind of explore the city a little bit more in detail just for myself. And here we have an overview over City 17. So it's a relatively small city, and the kind of main parts here is, again, spoiler alerts. It's going to come a bit more in my presentation, I think, than the other two. So this is the kind of journey of Alyx that she travels through City 17, beginning at the bottom right corner. And then the other kind of major elements in the city are the combined wall. So this enormous wall that these rulers have built up to protect something inside, which happens to be this thing called a vault that we don't really know what it is, but something that we're heading towards. And then there's also the Citadel, which is the headquarters for this alien rule. So we kind of start, as Kent was saying, by having an overview over City 17. We kind of introduced to it as a character right in the beginning. And I think this is really interesting. And this is the kind of genius loci, the kind of sense of place that I think is so powerful in Alyx. And I think it's really interesting that I had this feeling that, like, I've been to this place before. And I actually, me and Lara, we had a project in Sofia in Bulgaria. And we went last year almost 20 times. And this is a photograph I took from the window. And one of the art directors, or you could even call the architect of the city, Viktor Antonov, is from there, and is partially based on the city, which is a very, very beautiful city with an incredible array of different kind of architecture. But it also lends itself to the kind of world that obviously Vald is interested in. So these are my photographs on some of my trips there. This beautiful kind of mist that gets created sometime in the winter because it's in a valley. And this is actually our site, which I just wanted to share for all the Half-Life fans out there. This is the basement that we had to measure up. And I had a very, very striking feeling of, I've been here before when I explored the spaces. So my point here, which would be my only critical point towards the kind of how they're using City 17, is this pre-modern past. And we can see this statue here. We're never introduced to what this past is. And one thing that's really interesting with Sofia, which I hope that Val will take up in the later chapters, is how insanely rich Sofia is as a cultural place. So this is just the center. We have a number of churches. Some of them are almost 2,000 years old. There's a mosque and a synagogue and a cathedral, all within viewing distance from each other. I think there's an incredible kind of cultural history that could be a little bit deeper. Then the kind of thing that really interests me the most that Kent was really bringing up also is the underground and the spatial imagination of the city. So if we go back to the map again, this is essentially, again, what we're exploring, but this is the view above ground. And if we take out the floor, we see that there are actually a lot of other spaces, and they behave very, very differently. And this is something I think is really interesting because the underground is obviously used a lot in fiction, but also in architecture to kind of open up the possibilities for how big a space can be. If you go underground, then there's essentially no limitations. If you just imagine kind of buildings that you might explore, like malls or other spaces where you don't know how big it is, every corner you turn is going to be a surprise. And I think Half-Life Alyx uses that brilliantly. And we see that as architects a lot in kind of infrastructural projects, like these beautiful drawings of the London Underground, kind of spaces that we never actually get to see, right? Unless we make these kind of strange drawings. Or examples like this, where architects are working really hard to try and visualize this complexity between inside and outside. This is some images from a brilliant book called Cities Without Ground that's exploring the spatial complexity of Hong Kong, which I wouldn't be surprised if game designers are using it because it's really brilliant. And of course, game maps generally, this is a kind of reconstruction of Half-Life 2. They behave very differently because they don't need to be concerned really with the gray space around here. They can create the narrative for the corners and the depth and the kind of surprises to be tied and built with a narrative, which obviously architects don't really have the kind of the privilege to do. You know, we need to think about what's inside the wall. And this a term that architects often use called projet. It's actually a French word which describes the mass inside the wall. And what's so exciting about this concept is that often buildings can have the same exterior, but then depending on what the wall is doing, can have completely different rooms. There's something that Half-Life Alyx does really brilliantly. So we see this on functional levels sometimes, like in castles, where the thickness is for fortification. In other cases, because of the structure. But after the Renaissance and going onwards, Baroque and Rococo, we see more and more examples where the exterior and the interior had nothing to do with each other, and it's kind of exaggerated to create the spatial effect and surprise that you get when you're coming in. You see on the right there how unnecessarily big the roof structure is. And this is also really interesting reference back to when I started using game engines. This is the Unreal editor in 2006, where you actually, instead of creating space in a void, you carved space out of a solid, which is, I'm not a game designer, but I'm always imagining that that's the way a game designer kind of thinks. Because in Half-Life Alyx, you can't dig yourself into the void that's on the side of the space you're experiencing. So architects have kind of gone through a kind of reversed engineer way of thinking about the void of the spaces you're exploring. This is a beautiful series of models done by Moretti, an Italian architect, to explore the actual volume of churches and cathedrals rather than the actual architecture, which is normally what we think about that as the brick and mortar, not the void inside. Or this kind of beautiful like casting of ant hills where you see the space where you actually where you can actually experience, not the thing that makes that experience possible. So if we go back to Alyx again, so again, I just took these models directly from the files that comes with the game. Anyone can do this. So this is where we start. So this is what Kent was explaining. So this is the kind of little glass shed in the terrace of Alyx recognizance base, which we can see just in the middle here. And all of what Kent was talking about is basically in this bit of the city. Which kind of makes sense spatially. But then we look at one of the sections that you only really explore underground, it becomes a lot more complex and I think a lot more exciting. And I guess that some of you can kind of recognize yourself of the different sections. We have, for instance, here on the right, the crab-infested little nest where Alyx has to nip this flashlight off this corpse, one of the most horrific scenes. And then there's some scenes that are kind of slightly more complex and kind of packed. This is a combination of the processing plant and the distillery where we're partially outdoor and indoor, like Kent was referring to. But my favorite bit of experience in the whole game that I think does this so brilliantly is the North Star Hotel, which features one of the substations that keeps the vault up. So if we look at this is kind of the exterior view, but we actually start and we access the hotel through an underground subway station. And this is kind of a nice link to that Piccadilly Circus subway image that I showed before. But then so this is not in sequence of how you experience it, but this is basically then how it connects with the underground of the hotel, and then the interior of the hotel, and then the rooftop. So you see this incredibly complex network of spaces that are stacked up on top of each other. And in some cases, you have kind of links where you can see all of this. And then on top of this comes like the kind of hat or what you see from the outside. And you're constantly kind of you go into a big hotel, you know that it's not going to go on forever. But then the game forces you underground and up again, and constantly kind of keeps you on your toes because you don't know how big it's going to become. And here's just the zoom in of this really complex network of spaces where maybe some of you recognize the main kind of bar area of the hotel. Is the space that's just on the right of this screenshot. But having said that, I think that I picked up this book. This is a book that's on a table in the beginning of the scene, and it's from a fictional author. It's a part of Half-Life universe, which is about teleportation, which I thought like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like teleportation in VR is obviously a big deal. But then they never really kind of, it's really architecturally making sense, the whole city, which is awesome in a way. But if we think back, I was immediately thinking back of kind of early game maps, like one of my favorite games. As part of the Zelda game series, that where the actual map is a perfect square, but then it has two worlds. So it's the dark world and the light world, and you're constantly flipping between them. And then when you go into different buildings, then the map is completely defragmented. They don't make any sense. They kind of can grow infinitely. It's something that I think I would have really liked to see in Half-Life Alyx. And I think that's maybe, I'm guessing, where doing this in VR is so immensely complex, and it's already the most advanced VR experiences out there. So I'm hoping they pick this up going forward. And then, so my last point is on semiotics and the production of meaning in this world. So again, if we go back to the map and we look at the kind of, there's a kind of series of trajectories of things that happens in City 17 that all have their own kind of language, let's say. I'm just highlighting the substation there. You can see that the Combine wall is keeping the vault and the substations inside to protect them. So the main kind of characters, as semiotic characters we have, is the City 17 architecture and objects that we already spoke about a bit, then the Combine structures and machines, and then the Zen wildlife. And I think that then the narrative of Alyx lives in the semiotic relationship of these three orders. These are for me like the three main bits. So again, we go back to this, to City 17, which has a very, very real feel. It has this strange machines and things like this, but we really recognize it. And if we go look at some details, you constantly pass moments like this throughout the whole game, shelves that are full of stuff. And you can pick them up, and each thing you pick up, you recognize semiotically what that is. And that means that you recognize the form and the shape and the color, and then your mind tells you, oh, that's a beer bottle, because you know what a beer bottle is. And Valve uses this throughout the whole game. It basically never has any surprising objects within the kind of predefined City 17. It's all things you know what it is, down to kind of tables and even little statues, cigarette packs, glasses. And that helps you cement yourself in the world, because everything behaves also very realistically. And then this is then beautifully broken in a few places in the game where things flip and things mirror, like Andreea was explaining. This is perhaps my favorite moment. And it's only because you spent 20 hours in a world that makes sense, that then when it doesn't make sense anymore, you just kind of break down of just, at least I did, of excitement. And then we have the Combine structures. And what's interesting with these are that they create an illusion of function. And we kind of understand that the Combine is focused on goals at any cost and has no time or interest for culture or aesthetics. They have like a goal of domination or whatever the hell they're up to, and they don't have music, they don't have culture. So we judge these as like, this is what this substation needs to look like to do its job. But obviously, if we kind of look closer at some of these amazing moments when you're kind of pulling all these levers and stuff like that, it's clearly not logical. It's very, very aestheticized. You know, this could be done so much more efficiently if you had an engineer on the team that just, okay, there's a lid and a hatch, how the simplest way to do that. It is actually highly aestheticized, but it's communicating. And this is then one of the most amazing moments when these two worlds are kind of met. You have opened a very normal door and you step out into the most surreal environment just imaginable. And again, this is kind of when Half-Life manages to kind of use the semiotic language that has kind of taught you throughout the whole game and makes the effect ever so powerful. Then the last of these kind of characters that I think actually is the most important and the most impressive, which is this Zen wildlife. And this is when I could get the terminology wrong, so please bear with me if anyone is a true Half-Life kind of fan here. But basically throughout the journey, you encounter these infectious spaces where this alien life has just taken over. And you kind of understand that it's just a growth that doesn't have any real consciousness bigger than just the aim of biologically spreading and spreading itself, which means that just like you're judging the Combine structures having no aesthetic kind of purpose, the Zen wildlife also, you read it as having no other purpose. It just happens to be looking the way it looks. And it's amazing because it's a combination of being so horrific that literally you can't keep playing at some points, but also so immensely beautiful in many cases. And as you progress throughout the different chapters, the Zen wildlife shifts. So there's different species and they behave differently. And here's just some of my favorite moments in this little strange bathtub. There's this strange creature when you go up to it, it makes little noises. It has sort of eyes, and it reacts a little bit when you reach out to touch it. And this is as scary as it seems. Like you're in VR in this point. This is me going back afterwards and pre-recording. I would never go up and touch that thing the first time I played it, because you never know if it's going to kind of attack you or whatever. And then, yeah, so after a while, you can sort of try to appreciate the beauty. Here's another amazing moment. We reach out and touch one of these things that's like, is it a flower? Is it just a disgusting monster? And you realize that they all react in different ways. It has a rich behavioral logic. And then again, it spreads throughout the entire space. Or this moment with these kind of strange flowers that close when you get closer to them, which is all, and they make this beautiful noise, which links to the chapter that Andreea was talking about, because Jeff is sensitive to noise. So when the flowers close, he goes after you, which is terrifying. So I think that the Zen wildlife then is the kind of unpredictable agent adding the highest level of experiential satisfaction in Half-Life, and the illusion of a force which expresses beauty through its without any effort. And this is kind of a link to one of our favorite writers and kind of aesthetic theoretician, German 19th century, beginning of 20th century, who said that ornamentation is the expression of a force which has nothing more to achieve. And you really have this sense when you see this kind of growth that it seems to have no enemies whatsoever. It's just doing its thing, and it's getting kind of increasingly beautiful. And my last then reference back to architecture would be that often in architecture, when we see ornamentation, it follows a structural logic where it's kind of defining surfaces, or even if there are ornamentations, they are kind of framed and defined by the bigger structure. But there is a short period in architectural history in Europe, at least. There are other styles around the world which has similar kind of trends, which is the Rococo, which is very short-lived because it's the most exuberant of all architectural styles that Europe has ever seen. At least I would argue, where basically the aim for both artists and architects was to kind of portray some kind of force within the architecture itself that just does its thing and doesn't care at all of what it's meant to be doing, let's say. So these are some of the kind of fantasies that were drawn up that were never really built to this extreme level, but they were always guided by what's called the rokai, which is the kind of the original element in the Rococo genealogy. So they could behave in different ways and they could grow in different ways. And this is kind of how I was imagining the designers of Alyx creating the Zen wildlife, kind of creating a series of biological behaviors that behave differently depending on the type of world we're encountering. So then we see these rokais behaving in different ways depending on what they meet, if it's a corner, if it's a transition from a wall to a ceiling. And what's also so interesting, making comparison with Rococo and Alyx and the Zen wildlife in Alyx, is that both of them are highly artificial. They're both man-made at great resource and labor expense. You know, in this case, people have to carve this stuff or make casts. It's incredibly expensive, which is why it wasn't so, didn't stay around for that long. And in Half-Life Alyx, of course, the Zen wildlife is maybe the most incredible thing that's ever been made for a virtual experience in terms of textures, in terms of kind of animation and all of these things, and just design in general. So those were my 3 points.
Oh my gosh, amazing.
Thanks.
Go ahead and if you can stop sharing your screen. Oh my God, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Fredrik. When I finished playing Half-Life Alyx, I went on a search for people that were diving deep about the game, and I couldn't find anything. It was a lot of folks that were like releasing stuff like right when it came out, but not this type of real contemplative deep dive of exploration. I mean, I love that you took all those models and projected out the volume, because that is exactly what I wanted to see. A lot of the ways of just kind of like going back and recounting. And the amazing thing about Valve is that there's so many tools that are made available for us to really deconstruct and analyze this experience in ways that we've never had access to before. So not only is it like one of the most premier, you know, groundbreaking landmark AAA games, but there's going to be all these tools available for us to be able to continue to deconstruct it, to reconstruct it. And, you know, there's a lot of things that I go to in the virtual reality space that has no real architectural considerations. You just end up in these empty boxes. And so, you know, the thing that was so refreshing to me about Half-Life Alyx was the amount of architectural consideration that was in the piece, but I don't have the architectural training or the language to be able to pull back to other references. So I definitely appreciate both of you, Andreea and Fredrik, being able to kind of pull in these associative references to set this deeper context, but also to critique some of those aspects as well. I wanted to just like invite each of us to maybe share some thoughts, reflections, and then I want to dive right into the discussion, because I feel like we've got a lot of amazing people here. I want to hear what they have to say as well, but a couple of notes on each of the presentations for me, and then I'll sort of pass it over for you. Andreea, I love that you brought in that thing about Jeff. For people who haven't played the experience, there's a level where there's a character that can't be killed, and you are basically having to solve a spatial puzzle where you have to get close to this character, but you can't make any noise. You have to cover your mouth. There's all these things that you have to do to prevent yourself from being attacked. And given my experiential design framework, there's no active presence in a sense. There's no, like, you're not fighting or killing anybody. You're moving around, you're locomoting, but you're not actually killing other people. So it was interesting to me to hear some of the developers from Valve, because they take a very heavy, emergent, heavy playtest approach where they just playtest. And so they'll have a theory, but at the end of the day, it's what people respond to through the playtest. And so they had different Combine soldiers in that Jeff chapter, but they found that it was diffusing a lot of that tension that you were talking about, that psychological tension, because it was a context switch into exerting your will into the experience, but yet all about Jeff is about the fatedness of you not being able to do anything. Jeff can't be killed, and you just have to put your virtual embodiment into situations that you really don't want to be in. There's a lot of the puzzles that are all about your proximity to Jeff and you having to go through these different things that are against your native things that you would do. I know there was one section for me when Jeff gets out and I go into a room and I shut the door behind me, and I go out and I can't open the door, and I can't open the door until I open the door behind me to let Jeff come in. And I just remember being like, these moments that, like, you know, when I watched some playthroughs, people didn't necessarily have the same reaction. They just kind of zip through. But for me, I was like, you know, I think I only died once or twice in Jeff. And so I really was like super careful, but really immersed into that tension of that psychological terror. And I love that, you know, that you were bringing that out. And also the folds of that last experience, and just sort of the symmetry that happens, and sort of using our projection of our minds to see what we'd expect from multiple perspectives. And I love that you were bringing in some different references to be able to be in multiple perspectives and be able to see the architecture from different perspectives, and then to be able to have it make sense from those many points of view. And Fredrik, oh my God, I'm so glad that you figured out how to get access to so many of those things. I was struggling for myself to try to figure out, like, I want to see the blueprint, I want to see the map, I want to see where I went. And, you know, because Half-Life Alyx is a series of linear places, you can kind of get away with just going from one room to the next, but there's so many aspects of the experience where you're kind of like cutting in between different levels, and there's almost like this fractal scale dimension where you'll be on one level, but you can see other layers of that level. And so it's sort of the space that has the Zen wildlife that has encroached into these buildings. It has created holes in walls, holes in the ceilings, holes in the floors, that allows you to have an experience of these different architectural elements that you've never had before. And but I love the way that you just described all of that. I'm going to stop there and sort of pass it over to each of you to kind of share any thoughts and reflections, and then we can like open it up.
Should I go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have one general observation. I think it's very interesting how all three of us had a piece of discussion about classical architecture. So Kent, your description of a progression through space, where spaces expand and contract, This is a very classical approach to how you would design like an old museum. This idea of designing according to progression and hierarchy of spaces and modulating experience, it's not a modernist approach to architecture. So I'm very glad to see in all these fields values and ideas that modernism threw out the window in architecture kind of being brought back. Fredrik also showed these beautiful correspondences between this vegetation in Half-Life and Rococo and all of this wealth and the whole idea of ornament that, of course, modernism threw out the door. So this is like an important aspect for there any architects in the audience. And I want to bring one perhaps counter-argument to what Fredrik said. There is an aspect that I feel like should be mentioned into that discussion. So I was actually born not far away from Sofia. And yes, it has an amazing variety. So you mentioned that it has like synagogues and churches and mosques. I also lived actually for 1 year in Sarajevo in Bosnia, which is the city in the world with the biggest variety of all these types of churches packed together. But I think we need to be cautious against over aestheticizing that, because you know what is the story behind this variety in these Eastern European countries? It is centuries of war, occupation, and violence. That's how these countries got to have that. So if we take Bulgaria, it became Christian during the Roman time, then the Roman Empire split, and it was in the side of Constantinople, so they're Orthodox, they're Christian Orthodox. Then they were occupied by the Ottoman Empire with a lot of blood and loss of lives because the Ottomans just slaughtered everyone. So that's how you got the mosques built. And then later on, they were occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that's how you get Catholic churches next to Orthodox churches. And exactly the same history happened everywhere. So there's a bit of a paradox in urban design. You get uniformity when it's peace and there's a certain political order that endures over centuries. And then you get variation, which is what we love when we visit the cities. But the story behind that beauty and variation in this religious sense and cultural sense is actually a history of violence. And this is exactly what happened in Half-Life Alyx, right? There is a history of violence. We lost the war. We were colonized by a lot of foreign forces. Those buildings are beautiful and full of this alien vegetation, but they're void of humans. There was a loss, there was a violence that happened to get to that beauty. So I think I agree with all the points about the beauty of the wildlife, the life in there, but I think it's over aestheticized. I think it's ornament. And the danger behind this strategy and looking at it as ornament is that we're hiding behind visual beauty what was actually an act of violence. So for me personally, I would have loved if some of that vegetation retained a little bit of its danger. Had me engage with it, not just on an aesthetic level, but also reminded me a little bit of that pain, because all those people that died there and all those people that were eaten over by it and poisoned by it. And I feel like my relationship with this beauty of vegetation is a little bit like the relationship of a Western tourist visiting these Eastern European countries. You just see the beauty and the variety, but you don't really have a direct emotional relationship or intellectual understanding to the violence that gave birth to it.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that point because I think that's a super important point to make. And I think I would separate the wildlife and the combines from that aesthetic universe. And that's the parts that I wasn't so aware of, because when you see the kind of promotions that were put out by Valve, the kind of post-Soviet City 17 really takes protagonism. And I mean, it's pretty obvious, obviously, even in kind of in popular culture, it's been done so many times. I mean, it's incredible how it can still survive as a kind of as a backdrop for science fiction, and often there's some really brilliant writings. There's an article in The Verge, I think, where architecture critic Owen Hitherley was quoted, who's written several books about this, and how quite often the aestheticization of these kind of places are often done by people who've never even been there. And I think that that's actually highly problematic. And that's kind of what I was maybe hoping that, like, in the end, it just plays a kind of backdrop. And I think it would be really exciting, since obviously City 17 is not going to disappear from this story, right? It's going to be constantly, if Half-Life makes game for the next 4 years, it's going to be an important part. So they're going to have to, I think, twist it so that it gets a bit more life. And then the other thing that on that point that I think is really important to kind of consider is that, I forgot my point. No, you were talking about basically the kind of the complex history of a place like Sofia. And I think that one thing that does continuously bring us back to places like that, or our fantasy about places like that, is that because they have in the past gone through violent change, and there has been war, or you mentioned basically what some of these places have gone through, it means that there are different generations of ruins often, or the idea that there are generations of ruins. And I think that this may be one reason why we keep coming back to places like this, and maybe why Val decided to build City 17 on a post-Soviet Eastern European city. It's because ruins have lost, it's a building that lost its purpose, right? It kind of, every building is programmed. You never build a building to just be whatever, right? You build a building to be something. It's a school, it's a prison, it's a mall, whatever it is. If it's a ruin, if it's abandoned, then the building has become free, which means that in a kind of science fiction narrative, you're allowing for surprise and curiosity at every turn of the corner, because an abandoned building, one part can be squatters, another part can be something else, and that is basically kind of creating an open narrative playing field out of a building that, if you go into another building, it's not abandoned, it says supermarket on it, and you know that it's a functioning supermarket, you're never going to be surprised. Then you're kind of tacking into the kind of semiotic device that links to that program. So I think that that's partially maybe the reason why, and why it's so, it lends itself so well, the fantasy of these kind of places. Just to respond to that. And then the other, just the point that I would make, maybe to open up to, maybe you want to respond, but I'll just make my last point here on something. I'm imagining that there's maybe a mix of architects, but maybe VR enthusiasts, gamers, and maybe game developers in the audience here. And I think for an architect who creates virtual environments and works with game engines and stuff like this, it's often kind of imagined that architects have some kind of magic knowledge that you only get in architecture school. And to some degree, this maybe is something there, but I would actually brave myself to say that for the world that we're kind of preparing ourselves for, that I'm excited to work in the future, I'm much less equipped, I think, than an experienced game designer. I without having actually worked with any game designers, because even imagining creating a place, the whole setting of Half-Life Alyx, even if I had a team, I wouldn't even know where to start, I think, with figuring out the complexity of all of these things mashed together. I know Kent brought up this amazing working method that they seem to have, like one room at a time. It certainly doesn't feel like that when you're playing, but I think that there's some key knowledge that game designers have that certainly I, as an architect, don't know how to access. I hope that in the future there can be some more crossovers.
Yeah, and Andreea, did you have anything you wanted to respond?
I wanted to add something quickly. So my comment about the violent history of this and that being the source of the visual richness was not a moralistic comment. So I'm not pointing the finger at Valve and saying, hey, you're not acknowledging this, you're aestheticizing it. On the contrary, my point is that they should use more of it. they should give us more of this bloody thing. They should use it more into the story and to the game, because that's gonna enrich our experience as players as well. So I'm not saying, oh, why did you do that? I'm saying go deeper into it, just dig into it. And as a response to Fredrik's last point about architects and game designers, I'm actually working on a game right now, and I'm working with some people that come from a game design background, and we are dealing with exactly this room by room thing, where that's how they conceptually think of the space, and that's so not how I think of the space. So we have all this discussion. I'm like, what are you doing? That's not architecture. That's not how you go there. I'm like, or I'll say things like, I mean, I'm completely aware that we are never going to build that, but I'm like, well, you would never build it like that. but I'm not so sure that there is no magic sauce in an architectural education. I think what gives us that is very important in game design, it gives us an understanding of how rooms and spatial design can be the main character. And that's not to say that it should displace the story or displace the character that you're actually playing, but I think that's what we bring to the table. This richness of how architecture is one of the main characters. And I think traditional gamers and game designers, with some exceptions and some brilliant gameplay strategies that I can think of, don't tend to think of the architecture and the environment as a central conceptual piece of the story. They tend to think more in terms of the experiential quality and take it room by room by room, which I think it's missing on some potentials.
Nice. Yeah, thank you both for that. I think I'm going to unmute everybody, and then I might potentially mute people again if it's noisy, but allow people to unmute yourself. If we do happen to have some Zoom bombers, then we can weed them out and then continue on. But I'd like to just kind of like invite people to kind of hop in. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute all. That looks like I'm actually going to mute everybody again, and then but allow yourself to unmute yourself. If you do want to hop in and unmute you co-hosts, please hop in and go ahead and unmute and ask a question. If you have a comment, you know, try not to make it 10 to 20 minutes long. You know, we only have a certain amount of time. Try to make it brief. But yeah, just feel free to hop in and love to hear if there's any thoughts, any questions.
Alex, could you jump in and actually read your question? So Alex Colomb has an amazing question.
Oh, yeah. Alex, why don't you voice it if you can?
Sure, guys. Yeah, I was just wondering about that great quote, although, Andrea, maybe you can just read it because I'm dealing with my kids at the moment. Thanks.
Okay, sure. No problem. So Alex wrote, I love the Palladio quote Andrea referenced. How important do you all think it is to our phenomenological perception of virtual architecture for it to look like it should stand up? There is no functional need for that to be the case, but maybe it feels wrong otherwise. So this is a conversation I've been having with some of you on Twitter for the past half a year or since I've joined Twitter and become active there. So I'm a big proponent of having virtual architecture be as wildly different as possible from real architecture. And most of the people that answer to these tweets of mine say, okay, hold on a minute, but we can't go too far because it's going to be too unusual. It's going to be destabilizing. People are going to get sick and they're not going to like it. So let's just stick to things that are just nice and look real. So I think this is a kind of a very thorny issue in architecture. I don't think environments should be destabilizing unless it's done so in a purposeful way. What I'm dealing with sometimes is we do marketing virtual applications where the product is something that has nothing to do with the environment, like some motor or some kind of industrial piece of equipment, right? So I can't take I can't take the attention from that and do some crazy flying walls and windows around it. But the question is still in the room. It's like, of course, we don't need windows in VR because there's no cold air that we need to keep outside. And yet most of what we see being done in VR have windows. Most of the environments that we see for the virtual conferences that some of us have been part of lately absolutely treat every single architectural element as if it should look like it's standing up. So why is that?
I have a thought on that. I'm just going to share my screen real quick because when I gave a talk about looking at the future of immersive education, I came across this SAMR model, which is substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. So whenever you would go into virtual spaces, we want to like start to substitute it one by one. And I think that's natural. We're trying to see what the affordances of the medium are, what it can do, what it can't do. But we're just trying to do a one-to-one, you know, like see how now that we're, as an example, not able to go around and meet people face-to-face, is there a way that virtually we can do that? But eventually you get to the place where it starts to augment what you can do and modify what you can do. And eventually you can start to redefine stuff that would never be possible at all. And I think that there may be a thing with the predictive coding model of neuroscience, which is that we have certain expectations for how things should be. And if you deviate from that too much, too quickly, and try to jump straight to redefinition without going through each of these intermediary stages, I would argue, and this is talking to one of the architects that worked on a piece called Persuasion Machines, because he was saying that people need to have that, you know, that way to transition from their experiences of reality into virtual worlds. And I suspect there might be something there, especially from that neuroscience perspective, that we don't just jump straight to the redefinition, but that you do have to kind of go through these intermediary steps. And so maybe it's a part of that, but I would love to see more of this augmentation and modification, because I do see this kind of, you know, hopping into and just creating the, you know, going to a virtual conference and just replicating a big empty room that it can be just totally disposable and generic and is not connected to anything. And so that's why I love the architectural perspective, to see how you can start to like take insights and start to do things that are from a tradition. You don't have the same constraints of physical stuff, but you do have the same constraints of the number of polygons, the amount of complexity you can do. So you're still limited by what you can do within the virtual world, but starting to play with these types of things of impossible architectures and impossible spaces, non-Euclidean geometries, starting to do things that just would be just impossible. I'd love to see where that goes, but maybe there's an argument that you need to kind of like, you know, incrementally go there.
I have something to say, but I'll let Fredrik talk.
I was actually going to say, I've also got some things to say, but maybe it would be nice if we can get someone else to come in. I think we can stay on that point for a really long time as well, if anyone wants.
Yeah, do we have any other points or questions? Or Andrea, if you feel like you really need to share it, you can. But yeah, let's just.
So I think, Ken, I think you're correct, but I also think you're being too kind. So Alex and I were actually in the virtual market yesterday, and we went to some of the malls, and Alex and I are both architects who also work in the virtual space. So we were kind of like, what is going on here? When we noticed that all the spatial problems that we are aware of as architects with malls had been replicated in the virtual market. So we're like, okay, we're not advocating for completely crazy stuff, because I think you're right, we need to kind of take it step by step. But because we're being so lenient and because we're not criticizing this enough, there are mistakes that we're copying from reality to the virtual world. So there were things that I personally worked on, real malls that I was drafting and that I had issues with, and I had to find a spatial solution that are very known challenges for all the malls that were replicated into the virtual market. And Alex and I were like, come on, guys, like at least at least try to have the spatial understanding. And I'll give you an example. For example, when we design malls, the thing that triggers design is actually not aesthetics, is price of each store, right? So if you have a store that is closest to that open area, multi-height area that looks very pretty, where everyone comes up the stairs, the rent for that store will be more than the rent for these back corridors, right? That are kind of ugly and they're a little bit dark and you don't get that much traffic because they're far away from the stairs and you have no direct view from inside a store to any kind of double or triple height space. So the rent there would be much lower because of the quality of space and number of people. And this was completely one-to-one replicated in virtual reality. And there's no reason for that to happen because you do not have the kind of real estate constraints at all. And similar kind of detailing of the way you go up the escalator that, again, there was just no logical reason why you would carry that through. So I think we should be having more of this conversation and we should be critiquing things. So even some of the images you've been posting on Twitter, Kent, from, I think it was Laval Virtual.
Yeah.
A lot of those shots reminded me of kind of like what in the 60s were utopian views of modernism, like Tower in the Park views that to my eyes and to many architects' eyes these days just look like scary dystopian because we know those type of modernist projects have failed us miserably. And then we just replicate them in virtual reality. So that part of me is like, why are we taking dystopian architectural projects that failed and using them as poster images for virtual campuses?
Great. There's a couple comments. I'm going to invite either Lara or Lucia if you want to jump in and comment on the camera. If not, I'll just read the comment that you made here because it's sort of relevant, and then we'll move on to some other questions. You would want to jump in, either Lara or Lucia?
And you would need to unmute yourself, anyone who wants to jump in.
If not, I'll just I'll read the comments then, unless you pop in, then I'll let you speak. But Lara says, I think it's not only a transition issue, is also that if you remove all the references, all the familiarity, you also remove the ability to autocomplete and therefore involve other senses through our haptic library of memory. So yeah, I think that's the thing I was sort of the predictive coding of model of neuroscience, saying we have a bunch of expectations and affordances of how reality works, and that we're able to leverage that when we start to mimic things in the substitute. And when you start to deviate too far, then you lose some of those reference points. So that's a point Lara made. And then Lucia says,
yes, I wanted to maybe add
go ahead. Yeah,
that I think it also links to a lot of what Andrea was suggesting, with basically how we autocomplete the geometries of spaces when they are suggested, right? And that sort of builds virtual worlds in our minds when we are looking at particular types of details that are suggesting the space beyond. So I completely agree with you, Andrea, that is terrible when like bad design is being replicated in the virtual. However, I also think that somehow the referentiality will be important even beyond the transition period, because I think what it's doing is that it's bringing many more senses and many more aspects into an experience that is basically just visual.
nice. And Lucia, did you want to jump in and say your comment? If not, I'll read it.
Sure. So my comment is just coming from UX design for the 2D world. We've also seen an evolution in UX patterns and interaction patterns that came from mimicking the world of knobs and pages, and that translated into the 2D interfaces that we have today that have become so much more flat. And I would expect that in VR, some of the experiences today that are based on the real world will later become more abstracted. And I think it's part of the process of developing a design field.
Cool. And I know, Fredrik, you said you had a thought. Did you want to share it now that we've
Yeah. Lara was expanding on that, but I tend to agree with Lara and me. We've been on a Twitter debate online, and I think it's such a super interesting debate. And coming back to Alyx again, I think Half-Life Alyx, I think that obviously one of the reasons perhaps why these 20 hours of this experience is so visceral and goes so deep, it's because there's so much semiotic. It's a world of language, and that language taps into us through our predetermined idea of what these things are like. And I can't wait to see a AAA, a high budget game which is abstract and not built on semiotic languages. I think we'll probably see that at some point, and it would be really, really, really exciting. I think one really interesting reference is just something to kind of put into contrast the options that we have is the the film Vanilla Sky. Both the Spanish-speaking version and the American version, where this billionaire has the option to be put in a kind of constant state of virtual reality, a kind of chemically induced dream that is fully believable, and for hundreds of years potentially. And the world that he chooses is just slightly different from the life he already had. He gets a girl, his face is not disfigured, and the weather's better. Yeah, I think it's like, obviously our whole way of being is built on the semiotic language of how we use our bodies in the world, etc., which both speaks for, there's no kind of one or the other side here, because this speaks for the kind of bigger connection you can get in virtual experiences like Half-Life Alyx, if it has a rich semiotic connection, but also on how potentially boring and the kind of opportunities we're missing out on by speaking the language of physical reality.
When we have a question in here from John. John, did you want to hop on and ask it live? If not, I'll read it.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, John.
Yep.
Hi. Sorry, so I'm coming from the UK, and I've been obviously absolutely fascinated with Half-Life Alyx. I think it's just a really remarkable, almost emotional kind of turning point for this medium. But I think what I wanted to look into for just a minute, and to be honest with you, I just hopped on maybe 15-20 minutes ago. But I've been looking into a framework of game design, game analysis that was created by some guys at Northwestern University in the US. And they kind of proposed this notion that there is kind of like a bilateral 3-tier way in which games are constructed, which is mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics. And the notion being that the player goes through it, seeing the aesthetics, going into the dynamics, and then going into the mechanics, whereas the designer creates the mechanics, then the dynamics, then the aesthetics for the player to see, right? So, for example, if we take like the chapter Jeff in Half-Life, it's this idea that, the vodka distillery is just an architectural vehicle for kind of conveying this massive fear, and I hope that makes sense. But I just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts on this kind of notion of how important architecture is to this idea of the mechanics of game, of giving you examples, you use gravity gloves to give you examples of figuring out how to use weapons, for example. I just wanted to hear if you had any ideas on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I have a few thoughts. So yeah, thanks for joining in. And this video will be made available on YouTube. And in my talk, I did talk about the sort of how I approach the similar mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, which one of the people that is involved with that, I know it was Robin Haneke, who I've done interviews with her about the MDA framework. And so the MDA framework is a game design theory that was originated in the 2D. And so there isn't necessarily an endemic like embodiment or environmental aspect to that mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics. So when translating it into my approach, the mechanics are kind of like the rules and the sets of like the boundaries in which what I would call like the mental and social presence. It's like the aspects of the logic of the experience, but also the rule set that you're using. The dynamics, the way that they use it tends to be a combination of your interaction, but also your embodied experiences. And I actually separate those out into your agency and your active presence and your embodied presence. And so that gives, for me, that embodiment is like your senses are going to be directly addressed, and you have like the environment that becomes part of that sensory input. But that's distinctly different than the interactive aspects of it. I mean, all these things, they're all happening all at the same time, and it's difficult to kind of like draw clear lines. But for me, there's a clear line between receiving what's there in the environment versus you expressing your will into the experience. It's sort of like the dialectic between the yang and the yin, whether or not you're actively participating in taking action versus if you're sort of receiving the world around you. I think there's a lot of the world that is there that is in more of the receptive aspect of that embodiment and environmental presence. And the aesthetics is essentially the emotions. And that, for Robin Hunicke, she's saying you start with the aesthetics and the emotions that you want to achieve, and then you orchestrate all of the mechanics and dynamics around that. And how I would add in the embodied presence and the environmental presence is that's like a new layer in which that you have new capabilities to start to modulate that aspect of your embodied experience given VR that's distinctly different than the 2D version. And I have an interview that I did with Robin Hunicke a couple of years ago at Oculus Connect where I asked specifically about how embodiment starts to fit into this MDA framework. So you can look that up as well. But yeah, other folks have thoughts or.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting kind of analogy, and the distillery is perfect because I think that part of the success with Half-Life Alyx is that you might realize, I realized afterwards, that there's plenty of architectural interventions in the game that serve really only one purpose, but then it's so well weaved together that it's not obvious. Like I think the distillery is the only one that's really obvious, where like also there's loads of bottles and it's a very easy thing to make the noises. That is basically the whole mechanic of that action. And I think in the specific case of Half-Life Alyx, you don't want to know any of those things, ideally, for the gameplay to be successful. And I think that they have done an incredibly good job at basically keeping the player from those kind of secret game mechanics. But I would say that I think that it's a very big difference between games and VR as a communication platform, which I think, just like any form of computation, entertainment like gaming is going to be a very, very small part, maybe not economically, but in terms of what it's used for. And definitely VR, I think, is in any immersive spatial computation is for a human exchange. That I think is the purpose. And I do then think, and this is the kind of prediction we have, and I think what me and Lara were saying in our chat with Kent last year, that the kind of ultimate potential in a way is for architecture to become as fast as the spoken word. I mean, I'm not talking like 30, 40 years here, but where basically what that vodka distillery is doing for an entire 2 hours of gaming will be done in the seconds it takes to form a thought and then express it. So that like the architecture and the environment and the stage in which a social gathering is taking place, if it's professional or friend, leisure, whatever, that the kind of language of the space and the logic of the space informing the exchange. I mean, how that happens, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that that's a kind of aim where we will see the game industry learning from the future of social VR, which is going to obviously kind of evolve in innovation in the next 10 years, hysterically, with Facebook and Apple and other big companies coming into the field. But it's a super, super interesting thought. And I'm guessing that there'll be a lot of people just dedicating their whole career to just that aspect of architecture in virtual environments.
Yeah, and Karam, did you want to hop in and ask your question?
Otherwise, we have Nandi here at the bottom.
Okay. Well, Karam, I'll ask Karam's question. Do you think that Paolo Soleri might be a good guide for the transitional design consideration into VR. Who are the good architects to study in this transition?
Paolo Soleri is an architect. I'm not super familiar with exactly what his architecture was actually meant to do, but it's often judged for its aesthetics and formality, and very, very inventive in how it looks. And I think so. I'm going to just brush over that and say that's often how, maybe, I'm not sure if that's the way you're thinking about it, but quite often I think that if you're going to look at architects to be inspired for what any of this stuff could mean for in the future, rarely is it the ones that work with form. One might look at someone, you know, who's contributed more to architecture than probably anyone else, Zaha did, who is an expressionist formalist, who's done some of the most beautiful buildings you can imagine, but they don't have any kind of organizational structure that you can, I think, learn from in the world that we're discussing here now, if it's gaming or if it's virtual environments and spatial computing in a bigger sense. I think Cedric Price is someone who keeps coming back. He rarely really built anything. He was a professor at the school where we're teaching now, and he created a project called the Fun Palace, which many people in the VR world is talking more and more about now. It's a kind of idea for a kind of building that had an almost infinite amount of flexibility, but physically. Basically, it was just one big machine crane-like thing where any room, any building could be combined with any other thing, depending on what happened that day, essentially. And that kind of structure could grow endlessly. There's a bunch of other architects, but there's a lot of thinking like that, mainly in the 70s and 60s, around also the cybernetic movement, which was very important for architects. So I would say look back. Again, Paolo Soleri is definitely of that era as well.
Very cool.
I have something to add.
Oh, go ahead.
Quickly. I agree with everything Fredrik said, but I would also add, those study architecture and observe architecture. One of the most useful exercises we do sometimes in architecture school is to teach students how to do simulations in their head of how users might circulate through their building and might react to different spatial conditions inside that building. So thinking of spatial affordances connected to each corner and each crate and each shelf, it's a very specific, special type of thinking and you have to kind of get into the mode of that thinking. And it's all around you. You just have to kind of open that box. And this takes me to an article that I read about a review of Half-Life Alyx from the Time magazine. And I want to read you quickly the way this review starts. It starts like this: I'm on my hands and knees trying to dislodge a jar from behind a shelf. Inside is a bug that will heal my wounds. The predicament is my own fault. In my haste to grab the jar off the shelf, I knocked it off instead of picking it up. After some doing, I'm just able to palm out, roll the jar along the wall and free it. Then, making my way to a dark distillery, I spot some ammunition in an upside-down crate. I lift the box to grab the ammo, and a bottle of wine I didn't notice rolls off the shelf. I gasp, hold my breath, and grab the bottle just before it shatters on the ground. I'm not alone there, and I can't make any kind of noise. Trembling, I put a bottle back on the shelf, grab the ammunition, and start breathing again. And the conclusion of this Time reviewer is that the most extraordinary, high-intensity, memorable pieces of the whole Half-Life had to do with these kind of incidents that would never happen in a flat game. So these little glimpses of, oh, I turned around and there was a shelf there, and there was a particular object that shattered, and I had a particular reaction to that object that had a particular reaction to the story, in this case, Jeff, that really brings in the juice. So when it comes to such amazingly spatial embodied things becoming actually the main spine of your experience, it's very hard then to start with. Someone mentioned this study at Northwest that had like 3 categories that you have to go into to develop a game experience. I mean, how would you ever get to a concept like this, where this becomes the center point of your game, if you start with the idea that there's some kind of big categories that you should fill? So yeah, so long story short, my suggestion would be start to notice environments and how people interact with environments and the beauty of each of those things and how you could manipulate that in small ways.
Cool. I'm going to take one last question here, and then I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to leave the meeting open as long as Zoom doesn't kick us out. And if other folks want to just kind of like hang out for a little bit, I'm happy to hang out and chat some more. But Tyler asked, I'm going to ask if you wanted to hop on and ask your question.
Sure. Thanks, Ken. So this is just something I was making a note of when Andreea, when you were talking about the Santa Maria de la Paz. You know, that idea of the architecture going into these infinite realities beyond our vision, but that our imaginations can reconstruct. With VR architecture, are we not just talking about moving beyond the constraints of the physical environment, but about being explicit in our messaging that virtual experiences move beyond the constraints of our physical environment? So we're communicating more than just saying, oh, we can make interesting stuff, but that the whole experience, the medium and the technology affords moving beyond the physical.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think though that the lesson from these Renaissance architects is still to be taken to virtual reality. So the richness of any experience is an equation between how much richness and story you can put into what is directly seen and heard, and into what is implied by what is seen and heard, right? Because you have to create richness and story on these 2 planes in parallel. And that's when, in my opinion, you hit the jackpot. And that's what's happening with the architecture that I used as an example, right? Where there's something that you see, which is amazing, and gives you a hint of something that you don't see, which is more amazing. So that's the hidden part. And I think virtual reality should show amazing things, but also imply amazing things that go just in your mind even further than virtual reality can go. Because are there spaces and places inside our minds where not even virtual reality can go? Yes, there are. But virtual reality, I think, can be even more powerful than physical reality in implying those spaces and sending you in these trips deep inside yourself.
Yeah, well, I wanted to invite both Fredrik and Andreea, if you have any final thoughts after all these discussions, the points that you want to kind of leave with people that are either watching this live or maybe watching the recording.
I would just say that I feel I'm not satisfied. I want more. I want to talk more about this game. I think that like this is just, I've been looking forward to this since Kent, you invited us to this idea of setting this up. And obviously I think like both of you, I've kind of made a little bit of an extra effort to play it again and to think about it. And I thought that maybe I would stop and move on after I'm done with this, but I think I'm going to obsess for a bit longer. If there's anyone who wants to chat about it, I think I'm going to continue to read reviews. I'm going to look forward to all of the kind of fan analysis that will come out in the next couple of months. I'm pretty sure there will be an extensive reconstruction of the map in a couple of months, which I'm really looking forward to, which I'm definitely going to explore. But it has been really awesome. Yeah, I know we're kind of waiting on the tools, the modding tools. I know there's going to be official tools. A lot of what's happened so far has been really hacked together by a very passionate modding community. And a lot of work is going to be a lot easier to do a lot of this stuff once those tools become available. And
if the original source files are not encrypted in some way. I'm so glad that you're able to get access to a lot of that stuff. But yeah, and we're gonna, once I stop recording, you're more than welcome to sort of hang out. I know I'm gonna be, maybe take a quick bio break, but come back and just sort of join in the discussion as well. But Andreea, I don't know if you have any thing you wanted to sort of leave folks with.
I want to say thank you, and I want to make it clear to everyone that these type of discussions with all of you are so valuable for my own thinking process. And I've been very fortunate lately to participate in a lot of these discussions with different people, and it's really what's been bringing my theoretical work to the next level. And it's really this kind of this confrontation between my own preconceptions and background and all these questions and ideas and new mediums that are completely new to me, and this struggle, because it is a struggle to marry what I think architecture is and spatial design is with these new technologies and new directions and new opinions. And thank you, all of you, for being here and engaging with all these issues on such a deep level.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank both you, Fredrik and Andreea, for coming into this conversation. I know that setting this as a deadline and as a talk to have in this public fashion definitely forced me to formalize some of my thoughts in new ways and try to communicate how to talk about these spatial experiences. And I love to see each of your approaches of how you did that. And I look forward to more broader critical discourse within the larger community, especially as the tools become available and we can start to deconstruct and really, create, there's so many opportunities to use this game to be able to create tools, to be able to talk about experiences, and to also use the tools that are available for modding to be able to put some of our theories and actually build mods and tests within the tools that are made available. I think that's, for me, one of the most exciting things is not only the game, which is amazing, but what's going to come out of the community now that these tools are available. And I know that once I finished playing Half-Life Alyx, I was really hungry to really unpack it and dive deep. And I'm glad that this is sort of the first iteration of that. But also for me as a podcaster, this is as this global pandemic is happening, for me to try to start to think about, okay, well, how can I start to evolve ways of talking about it? And, as I think about the Voices of VR, this is some of the things that are talked about here. Actually, you just need to see the video, and it's hard to kind of like fully appreciate what people are talking about in the absence of seeing those visuals. And so I think that's great to be able to expand out into these other mediums, but also I'm supported by Patreon and finding new ways to create value for the community. And so if you did find value from this discussion and this talk, please become a patron to be able to support, and for me to continue to do this. As I do these different types of hostings, there's certain fees that come from Zoom and all that stuff to be able to facilitate these conversations, but also to, I just want to be able to make these types of discussions freely available for people, and to have them and to bring people together, to invite the type of rigor that you get in a conference talk, to be able to have these discussions and to unpack it, and then eventually potentially like have the after party in VR. I think for right now, I'm going to, in the moment, stop the recording and then just allow people to hang out and continue the conversation, and to jump in if you didn't want to be on the public record in the recorded version, and then to continue to unpack it. But I'm excited just to have this conversation and to see the different approaches. I didn't have an architectural background or education, so this is a good excuse for me to satisfy my insatiable curiosity to see these different lenses. And I think that's part of the value of what we can start to create here, is bringing this interdisciplinary approach with lots of these different perspectives, and to just hear what you had to say about it. And maybe this will be an ongoing series of people from different industries sort of like seeing what their lens is looking at this game. So, but yeah, thanks again, Fredrik and Andreea and everybody else for joining me here.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Kent and Andreea.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and I have, let's see,